Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Jason Mackenzie. Jason is a writer, speaker, and grief advocate whose life was transformed through personal tragedy. When he lost his wife to suicide after her battle with bipolar disorder and his daughter to a car accident. Now, through his Substack newsletter, Improving the Condition of Man, and his work with men facing life's hardest challenges, Jason helps others navigate grief, mental health struggles, and the journey toward authentic living. His personal experience with loss has given him unique insights into how men can process emotional pain and grow through life's most difficult moments. Jason, welcome.
Hey, Wes, I'm super happy to be here, man.
Yeah, me too. So you've been open about projecting an illusion that you had everything together, everything looked great on the outside while actually struggling really deeply inside. What led to that disconnect, and why do you think so many men fall into that pattern of maintaining the facade even when they're suffering?
Man, that's a great question. I think to set the context, I need to go back a little bit in time and talk about my first wife, as you mentioned. Her name was Cindy. And in 2010, after just a horrific battle with mental health issues, she took her own life. She's a mom, a wife, a police officer, and really, just a series of trauma, I think caused the wheels to come off finally, after the birth of our second daughter, and ultimately it led to her death. And I think for me, during that time, I went from really having the illusion or buying into the illusion that I was the captain of my destiny. I'm a man. I had a up and coming career. I'd recently been promoted. I was flying all over the world on a nice expense account. Like I was living a dream, man. And I think as everything in my life fell apart, I had no idea. I went from, again, really buying into the illusion that I was a captain of my destiny to realizing I had hardly any control over anything. Every single day was dictated by her mental health issues. Whether she was going to wake up still crushingly depressed or whether she was going to move out for 3 months and me have no idea where she was or anything in between. It was just completely unpredictable. And I think that for me, the only thing that I felt like I could control was the perception or the image I portrayed to other people. And for me, I felt like I was falling apart. I was started drinking heavily. I acted out a lot. I had a lot of anger and I felt completely out of control in almost every area of my life. And I really needed people to believe that I had it together. So even the people who understood, I think, what I was going through, I really got a sense of validation from them when they would say things to me like, Jay, you're so strong. I don't know how you're doing it. If I had a son, when he grows up, I wanted to be a husband just like you. And I craved that validation, but it increased the pain because I knew it wasn't really warranted, because I knew there was things, obviously I did lots of things I was proud of during that time. I did some things I was ashamed of during that time. But I on one hand was living this lie. And on the other hand, I had this sort of cognitive dissonance because I knew I was living a lie, and I was trying to make people buy into some aspects of it. And so, why is that the case? I think for men especially, it's really, really hard to admit you need help. Much less ask for it. Even to admit that you need it seems like a sign of weakness. It seems like you don't have it together. And but I think as much as anything, it really, the creating the illusion of strength gave me some weird thing to hang on to in the midst of all of the chaos that was going on around me.
I'm wondering, do you feel like before you experienced that terrible death of your wife, do you feel that you would have been confident in calling yourself a strong person? And yet then after it happened, was it pretty safe to say that, not that all that went out the window, you were strong in some ways, I'm sure, but I imagine it was redefined for you and you had almost like a wake up call that you came to terms with the weakness more than it was the terms of the strength.
That's a great question. Yeah, if you think about even the context in which all this happened. I mean, I was working in a automotive manufacturing company. I I was a leader. It was a very blue collar. A very automotive manufacturing is a very kind of cutthroat industry. It's margins are thin. Customer demands are high, like it's 24/7 a lot of the time. And I had gotten to where I was, which was above, let's say, my career had progressed more so than the average person my age, I would say. And I got that way by being a certain way. And that was, doing my best to pretend I was the alpha in as many situations as possible, even though I'm not really like that. I mean, but I think that's a big part of the reason. And, I didn't to say that. So to have my identity challenged, my self concept challenged in such a way, like I went from, again, being the captain of my destiny to basically a passenger, not knowing what is going to happen next and not knowing if I'm going to be able to handle it. I think that's why I started drinking so heavily, right? I mean, I didn't want to admit that I couldn't do this on my own, even though what we were experiencing as a family, there's no playbook for it. There's no way that a young dad in his 30s can be prepared to have his wife, who's and the mother of our children, to have her mental health just completely spiral into darkness in the span of, complete and utter chaos in the span of months. I mean, and so, I didn't know what to do. And, I also did things that really hamstrung myself. Like, so for example, I went to see a therapist during that time, but all I did when I went to see the therapist, I wasn't open with him about what I was going through. I wanted someone to validate for me that my wife was crazy and that I was a strong person for getting through it. Right. So, but to answer your question, I don't think that I ever really accepted that, embrace the idea. I don't really want to call it weakness, but just embrace the idea that I couldn't do it and manage it all on my own. And that is one of the main reasons that I developed such a huge drinking problem, because the emotions that came up during this time were obviously extremely intense. They were really quite unfamiliar to me, and I hated them. I hated the feeling of fear and abject sadness and anger and confusion that ultimately watching my wife die over a period of 5 years. I'd never experienced the emotions that come with a process, that's that ongoing and that painful. And so I just not really by conscious choice. I mean, I suppose every time I decided to take a drink, it was a conscious choice, but I just almost by autopilot, coped my way into a huge drinking problem. And it really wasn't until 5 years after death when I stopped drinking that I gave myself the space, and I had kind of come to the point where, okay, I need to, if I'm going to be able to move forward here, I need to face these emotions.
And all those emotions you did experience that you weren't ready to face. I mean, I think a few things. One, many of us men don't have support systems in place because we've purposefully relied only on ourselves to get to where we're at. So when something happens that takes us under that we can't handle by ourselves, we look around and we say, most of the time, the bottle in a weird way is our closest friend, the thing that we connect most with, or in a weird way can feel most safe with, almost being vulnerable. And you talk a lot about how that vulnerability, though, can lead to meaningful connections and that you came to that moment. I'm curious about the story of when you posted about your struggle with the drinking on the auto plant floor and how that started to change your relationship with the people around you.
Yeah, for sure. So I stopped drinking in 2014. Had, I guess you could say, my rock bottom moment where I finally got to the point where I realized I needed to stop. And so I stopped. And about nothing happened right away. But about 6 months later, I want to say, I had started, waking up with a clear head. I had started, doing things like, personal development types things, trying to have a morning routine and all this kind of stuff. And just started to realize there was a whole world of sort of personal development and non-traditional ways of continuing to educate myself on some skills that might be useful. And so as I did that, I really started to, I want to say actually one thing is that for anybody out there that is actually struggling with something like alcohol or really any addiction, is what what caused me to, well, sort of a trigger for the story I'm about to tell was that when I was drinking, when I was a full on addict, I would say, I constructed a prison for myself that made it almost impossible to quit, because what I would do is I hated what I was doing. Like, I mean, by the end of the drinking, all the rationalizations and just stupid lies I would tell myself and others, I mean, they were all starting to come crashing down. I didn't even believe them myself anymore, but it was terrifying for me because as much as I hated what I was doing, the only future I could imagine without alcohol was actually worse than what I was already doing. So I would imagine trying to quit and be like, oh, you're just going to quit and fail again, and then be again, like for the millionth time. And you're going to be just more evidence you're a freaking loser. Or, I don't even know if I can socialize if I'm not drinking. My wife is going to know I was lying to her all these years when I said I had it under control, blah, 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 blah. And so basically what I did was I constructed this alternative reality, which was actually worse than what I was already doing. So it actually made it easier just to keep drinking. So I didn't have to face that made up future. Then I stopped drinking and I realized the exact opposite started to happen. Like, my life started to get better in every single way. And I remember thinking, wow, that's crazy that that prison that I was in was entirely of my own construction. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, I mean, when you're struggling with something, it's the loneliest thing in the world. Even though logically you know that millions of other people must also be struggling with the exact same thing, but there's this. It is at the same time. Can be the most isolating thing in the world. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, first of all, I must be doing this in lots of other areas in my life too. But secondly, there's got to be tons of people around me that are doing this. And so I was working in an automotive manufacturing plant, a senior leader in the plant, and so go in there every day and I work with all these people on the shop floor. And, I had very superficial sort of work type relationships with them. And it was a very difficult plant. So the plant was losing money at the time. And it was really sort of an us versus them mentality versus management and the people on the shop floor. And so it was a pretty difficult environment to work in. Anyways, as my life started to get better, I don't know I don't really remember what caused me to want to do this, but I just wrote on this, got my computer out, wrote it on a piece of paper, you know, hey, I used to really have a severe drinking problem. I've been sober for however long it was. Here's some of the things that made it really hard to quit. And here's some of the things that I've noticed since I have quit. And for anybody else that's struggling, I just wanted to share that with you. And so I decided to go put this up on the bulletin boards around the plant. And man, I'm telling you, like I was terrified to do this. I don't even know what compelled me to do it. But I remember, I mean, just all the stories you tell yourself about what people are going to think. They're going to think I'm some kind of freak or whatever. But anyways, I did it. And it probably within an hour, people started coming up to me and saying, and these are all people I'd worked with for a number of years, and just started telling me their stories and thanking me for putting it up and sharing more of their experience that I never would have had the opportunity to know otherwise. And what I found was I just started having all these way more meaningful conversations with people that I worked with every day. And it felt so freaking good. And interestingly, I mean, it's not surprising to me now, but I also started to become a more effective leader because people trusted me. They felt like it was a real deal. There was some psychological safety there. But I think the main point is that even in what you would think would be, one of the tougher environments to be vulnerable, just as simply the act of going first just revealed then, as it has revealed to me every time since then, that you're always surrounded by people who are waiting for somebody else to go first. If you can share a little, if you can find the courage to share a little bit more of your story with somebody, a little bit, what you've been through, what you're going through, you'll find that there's other people just waiting for you to go first. And when you do that, you make it safe for them to do that in return. And it's in that space that the most amazing conversations and connections and insights and opportunities present themselves. So.
You bring up a point I'm struck by that I think many men or all men crave connection and were made for it outside of their wife, spouse, whoever, by the way. But I think we have this default view that I can't open up with my buds. I can't share. It would be weird. It would be awkward. I think you challenge that notion in your story to say, okay, you might think that, but have you tried? Have you actually tried to put it out there? And in my experience, one of two things happens when you actually try, and it seems like this happened to you. it almost socially vets who you should and can be close with. Meaning, if you are vulnerable and share that, and someone laughs at you, makes fun of you, dismisses you, why the hell do you want them to be friends with you to begin with? Why would you want a conversation? And yet, if it's someone who is real and says, hey, I appreciate you sharing that, that meant a lot. And there's this sense of openness, it filters out the people that you'd want to be around anyway. Because the other thing is, if you can share something real that's not so pleasant to accept, and this goes for dating too, and that person accepts you, that is a tall tale sign that they're not only trustworthy, but they're going to be a good long-term relationship in whatever capacity you have. Even if it's at work, that once you go there, now I bet if you still picked up the phone and called any of those guys, might be a little weird at first, but you could go back there and have those conversations. And I that's what I take away, is this encouragement to say, even if you don't know what compels you, if you don't have those connections and you have something to share that you're struggling with, just share it. Because worst case is you stay where you're at, but best case is you have a community and you start making those connections.
I agree with everything you just said. And, what I find is one of the businesses I run is a mastermind program for dads who are business owners. So the idea is we teach them skills and create a tribe where they can be learn to be better husbands, fathers, and business owners. And what always happens is when these guys come into this group, our whole idea here is to make this a safe place for you to lean in about whatever's on your mind. Like there's no judgment. There's no anything, I mean, we've all had moments where we felt like we're on top of the world, and we've all had moments where we felt like the world was falling apart. And so, and what I find though is that, so once guys get a taste of these types of conversations, it's challenging to go back to a strictly superficial, more surface level, typical like guy relationships where you just, talk about sports and, bust each other's chops. But what I also want to say is that I don't want to make it sound like these types of vulnerable, like these relationships where you're able to be vulnerable with other guys. Those relationships are also still full of all the awesome guy stuff where you make fun of each other all the time and you're ruthless and like, you know what I mean? Like all that stuff. Like it's not like all, airy fairy or whatever, but but there's more than one speed, so I can have my buddies, we can make, like, we text each other horrible things all day long, insulting each other every which way from Sunday. However, when one of us needs to lean in, we can do that, and the channel, and like it immediately switches to like, I'm here for you, brother. You know what I mean? And I think that's a really wonderful thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think if we take that same principle, we would never be like someone or be in a relationship with someone who we can only connect with in one way. I mean, how crazy would it be if with your wife, you're like, yeah, I can only joke with her and we're in love? It's like that never stands true. So to your point, why would it be true in friendships? And that is a dualistic thinking to say, oh, if I get real, if I get mushy or all that, then I won't be able to share. But in fact, in my experience, it's almost enhanced and better places the more humor, shallow stuff, because that has a place too. But if that's all there is, that gets really old and valueless quick. But when you can counterbalance it with some real talk where you share, it's a treat and it's a gift to be able to express your masculinity in those different forms, because that reality is within you either way. Whether or not you think you need to be vulnerable and share and connect with other guys, that is a deeply embedded human need that you are ignoring. And by solely focusing on the shallow stuff, it's slowly dying inside. And yet, to your point, once you unlock that, it actually doesn't take away, but enhances that part. And you talk a lot about how there's this powerful lie that grief is something only weak people do. And I appreciate your pushback a little bit with not seeing it as a weakness, the grieving that you went through, but just a different frame of processing. We often think that we should, put it behind us and keep moving forward. I'm curious what you think, how this cultural narrative affected your own journey through loss. I mean, as you said, you hit all the boxes for the ideal guy. You even used the term, alpha male. You were stereotypically following the path, and not necessarily in a bad way. I would say just a normal way. because that's all you knew. I mean, and that's the other thing is like you only do what you know is in front of you. So I'm curious, having believed and lived that cultural narrative that grieving is something only weak people do, what would you say to men who are avoiding grief?
Man. Well, I think what I would say is it cannot be avoided. And if you try, it will destroy you either in a catastrophic way or by slowly strangling the joy and the hope and a lot of the goodness from your relationship with yourself and your relationship with others. And, I think, for me, when my wife passed away, I remember because there's things that are true when you lose somebody you care deeply about. One of those things is the world continues to spin. You know, the sun rises every day, and there's things, all your obligations, they continue to be your obligations, and so I remember for my wife, I remember driving off the cemetery with my young daughters in the back seat and literally thinking, okay, that chapter of our life is over and it's time to go on and rebuild a new life. And so I remarried, bought another house and all of that. And I just had this idea. I don't even know where I got the idea, but I had this idea that grief was something weak people did and I was to picture people, lying on the couch, bawling their head off. Well, strong people like me took care of what needed to be taken care of because who else is going to do it? And what was interesting was, so that was a story I told myself and I legitimately believed it. And the thing was, though, is I continued to drink heavily for 4.5 years after my wife's suicide. And it wasn't until I stopped with the help of my current wife, Tanya. Yeah, I mean that. Anyways, it wasn't until I stopped that I about 6 months after I started experiencing all of these really intense emotions. Like I started feeling a lot of anxiety that I hadn't really felt before, and deep sadness over Cindy's death. And I started writing about her and our experience together and going to visit her grave more often. And I remember saying to my wife, now I thought I was going crazy, like really losing my mind because all these emotions were so unpredictable. And I remember saying that to her. I said, do you think it's going crazy because I'm spending so much time like thinking, being upset about my dead wife? And she goes, dummy, you're grieving. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, that feels, even though up until that moment, it never crossed my mind. And interestingly, what also that going through that process, what it made me realize was, I mean, this sounds almost unbelievable to say now, but I'm sure there's guys that are listening who can relate to this, or maybe it'll plant a seed. It never occurred to me a single time while I was drinking that the pain from my wife's suicide and my alcohol abuse were related to each other. It never crossed my mind. And it was after I stopped and started to grieve that it became so obvious to me what was actually happening. And I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, that is wild, man. I mean, I had this like almost 5 year period after her death where this force of like loss and like grief trying to be seen, let's say, was such a big influence on my life and I couldn't see it. So, with that being said, I in this really weird way, I mean, uh that experience gave me a set of tools to navigate the loss of our daughter 15 years later. And that has been that has been the most horrific experience of my life. It feels orders of magnitude worse than my wife's death, because my wife's death was horrible, but it was also not a total surprise because it had been really like a 5 year downward spiral. And I mean, in some ways, I was as much as one could be. I mean, I was kind of, it was definitely an option I had considered. You know, uh, with my daughter, I mean, it's just I think for generally speaking, I mean, there's not too many things in the world I think that are probably worse than losing, a parent losing a child. And I've just been really committed myself to facing grief in whatever ways it shows up. But I will say, even though I write about grief and I talk about grief and I don't know if I'm an expert in grief, but I know more about it than I used to, let's say, it is still, man, like when I have the moments where I just had one, maybe last week sometime, where I clutched my daughter's urn to my chest and just bawled my head off, is as much as I know that is part of the process, I still have to fight through. I hate it when it happens. I hate it because this story, this narrative running through my head is you can't protect your family in this condition. Like, what the hell, man? You know what I mean? And it's that, whether it's biological or I'm sure it's biological, sociological, whatever, but that narrative is incredibly strong and visceral. The difference is I don't really listen to it anymore. I notice it and I allow myself to face what needs to be faced, but I don't like it at all. It's a terrible feeling. And maybe one day I'll be zen enough to just allow these moments to happen and just embrace them with whatever. I mean, I'm not there yet, but where I am is I do my very best to face what needs to be faced. And I think that is, as hard as that is to do, it is crucial to heal and move forward after the loss of someone or something you love deeply.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And it sounds like there was this common theme driving away from the cemetery that first time, and then having a delayed correlation with the drinking and the pain, that there was unhealthy coping skills that you used to avoid feeling that emotional pain. Yes, through the substances, but also through mindsets and staying busy and just narratives you had. I'm curious, it sounds like then when the death of your daughter happened, the biggest shift was, yes, it was more painful in its own right, but you were more present to more of the pain in a way that helped you actually grieve with it. That it sounds like with the first loss, you weren't as in touch immediately. And then even as you were, it was a little more gradual and not as straightforward. So I'm curious what insights you've gained from both avoiding and not avoiding the addictive nature of pain, meaning that, pain in and of itself is something we all feel. But, you mentioned this with substance abuse and the term addiction. Of course, I don't want to overstep and call pain an addiction, but I think that we have a certain relationship to it. And that relationship determines how much unnecessary suffering that happens to us, meaning no matter what, it's painful, but how we respond to it determines how much of that suffering. I've heard the analogy, if you put a knife on, someone's arm and you press it, if you were to jerk really quickly, reactive, you get cut. If you slowly remove it, you're all good. And I think a lot of us men do the same. We impulsively pull back the arm and we have all these cuts. And so I'm curious what you've learned from that first experience of delaying it and disassociating from the pain and then coming to terms with it, to then the second experience, which, even though it was more painful, it sounded like you actually had a healthier grieving process because you didn't avoid it.
Yeah, well, I would say it's not had in the present, in the past tense, it's having, and it's probably something that will last for the rest of my life. I mean, so in some way, shape, or form, I mean, it's not a thing you get over, right? So in some ways, it's two, 2 years and a little bit after the loss of my daughter. It's as difficult now as it has ever been, but it's just different, right? So which I can talk about in a minute, but yeah, I think you're right. The I mean, if you listen to, I don't know if you're familiar with Gabor Mate, I'm assuming you probably are, but I mean, he says behind addiction, there's always pain, right? And it's, I think there's, how do you tolerate the intolerable? What feels intolerable at the moment, and when you lose someone or something you care about deeply, your capacity to your body is, you're almost already, like, always in some sort of level of fight or flight. Like, whether you have your nervous system is ramped up, and so what happens is your capacity, like if you were to go from calm to, say, fight or flight in a normal person without who hadn't experienced trauma or anything, I mean, there'd be a progression there of, like, the intensity building. Like, say something happened and you started feeling some intensity in a healthy person. There's or maybe I don't want to say healthy necessarily, but like a, well-regulated person, let's say, there's a time where that charge builds up, and there's more time to make choices, to sit with it or talk about it or whatever. But when you're in a state of you know uh, uh, a level of dysregulation, or in somatic experiencing, they call it like it's a charge, or you're in fight or flight. Your the difference between feeling that an increase, like I'd say a really tough emotion, it can send you into a coping mechanism almost immediately, because you're already right at the limit. You're barely, and so it's like it pushes you over the edge. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, a couple of weeks ago, I went to the library, and I was having a fairly difficult day. I was feeling really sad over the loss of my daughter, and I went to the library, and I was doing some work. And when I came out of the library, I had totally forgotten this when I got to the library. When I got out of the library, I remembered that my daughter's accident site was just a few hundred feet up the road on the other side of the library. And just that memory sent me to some shitty fast food restaurant where I stuffed my face, man. Because I was already at my limit of what I could tolerate, and I knew I could sit with it. And most of the time I do. But this time I was like, screw it. I don't want to do this right now. I just wanted something to cope, and I think that's an important thing to realize. But at the same time, whenever you're experiencing pain, there are a million things you can do to distract yourself or cope from the pain. And every single one ultimately makes it worse. That's the burn, right? I mean, the only way to sit with it is to face it. And that is not it's not something to strive for perfection, because you will not be able to do it every single time. There's going to be times where you turn to some coping mechanism, and that's okay. I think the main thing is to realize we're human, we're flawed, we're doing our best in a really difficult situation, whatever that situation actually happens to be, and there'll be times where we act in ways that are in alignment with our values. There will be times where we act in ways that are out of alignment with our values. And what can often happen with people is when you act in a way that maybe, self-destructive or not in alignment with your values, it's really easy to beat yourself up about it, to think you failed, to label yourself as a loser. The problem with all that is it just increases the pain, which makes it more likely for you to seek another coping mechanism again. And you might as well, because you're a loser anyway. I mean, this is how the narrative plays out, where if we can just learn to be a little bit, more compassionate with ourselves, and realize that there is no perfection here. The human experience, I mean, I just turned 52. I mean, if I've learned anything by this point, the human experience is friggin' messy, you know? And there's times we feel like we're on top of the world. There's times we feel like we can't tie our own shoelaces. And when you have one of those moments where you make a choice that is, let's say less than ideal, the question you have is, what do you do with that? Right? You can use it as a learning opportunity to say, okay, I did that. What happened here? What can I learn from it? And then move, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and move forward. Or you can use it to as increasing, like, just another piece of evidence that you suck. And you can, use that to drive yourself even further into the ground. And it's ultimately, at the end of the day, it is a choice, and it's a choice that we all have the power to make. But it's also one that, when we're in pain, we can give away that agency we have without even really realizing it.
Yeah, wow, what a good word, giving away agency. And I appreciate that viewpoint that the grieving and the healing, it never stops to a degree, because the situation in some ways eternalized, right? I mean, the love you have for your daughter and your wife are forever. I mean, truly, those things never stop. So therefore, the loss of having that human connection would never stop either. And I think, so many of us guys, we're hard on ourselves. Like you said, I call it shitting on yourself. You have all these expectations that you put, and ultimately it's not helpful. And it sounds like when you got triggered, from a trauma perspective, the trigger is anything that reminds you of the trauma as if you were experiencing again. And the healing comes from going through that, because you're going to get triggered again, but doing it in a way that helps you face it without being overwhelmed by it, but instead accept it and then integrate it. And in some ways, the only way to do that is to get triggered and to go stuff your face and to avoid, to do it wrong before you do it right. But that you tell yourself, I'm not done. I'm open to being triggered again, not because I want to, because I need to, because then that's the practice. That's the opportunity for me to have that integration, for me to reface it, for me to reacclimate to it. Because that's the other thing, we shut down our psyche because it's so painful in that moment to deal with it. We say, never again. I don't want to touch it. It gets frozen in our bodies. Then we have a trigger like that. All of a sudden, the ice melts and we feel the burn of that pain, and because we're not used to feeling it, because we're not actively processing it day to day, understandably, you have all these obligations as a human, the world keeps spinning, and then we do get overwhelmed. We do it wrong. But I'm encouraged that it sounds like after that experience, you didn't allow yourself to fully get discouraged and down on yourself. You said, you know what, wasn't the best, but I'll get another shot. And 40 different opportunities later, here you are, not perfect, but a healed and integrated man who did not shy away from the trauma, but has now started to acclimate, see it for what it is, not for what it isn't, and to integrate it. So I appreciate you sharing that, man. And the last thing, I'm really hoping you can speak to this part, this negative self-talk of not just the belief we have that we beat ourselves up, but the actual things we say and do to ourselves. So I'm curious, when men are finally ready to face the pain, when they do get triggered, they do it wrong, but they stick with it and they begin healing, what tools have you found most helpful to be effective? I'd like to talk about some approaches like acceptance, self-talk, understanding what you can control versus what you can't.
Yeah, great question. I mean, for me, I think the biggest tools, the most effective set of tools I tend to rely on is some of the ones from Stoic philosophy. So, and really, it's about focusing, understanding it, how to focus on what's in your control, like to identify and focus on what's in your control, and to release the emotional attachment to what isn't. Because when you think about what's in your control, there's a few things, but they're very, very important. One is how you choose to look at things, right? So what's how you choose to look at what has happened to you, what is happening to you right now, and even what you would like to happen to you, even if it doesn't end up coming true. But that the ability to decide how you are going to look at things is one of the most powerful gifts that is inherent in us in our humanity. I just think it is absolutely critical to remember that. And I'll come back to an example of why that is. The second thing that's in your control is your desires, like what do you want for yourself, for others, and your intentions. What do you plan to do? That's in your full control. And then your actions, your decisions, and your actions. And notice what's not in your full control is the results of your actions, because there's tons of variables that can influence those decisions. So then you think about, okay, what's not in your full control? Well, your body is not in your full control. You could do everything right and still get cancer. Your reputation is not in your full control. I mean, you could do everything and have everything with the utmost integrity and still have a business deal go sideways and your partner smears your name, for example. Your property's not in your full control. They could get wiped out by a hurricane tomorrow. So there's all these things that are outside your control, but we spend an obsessive amount of time agonizing about these things, right? And so if you like, I'll give you an example about grief. Back to the original element of how you choose to look at things. So I could, and so I have a TikTok channel about grief, and so I've been fortunate enough to just have like thousands of people comment, and it really gives me an insight on other people's grieving experiences. And so for me, like one of the things that parents who lose children say a lot of times is, "I'm permanently broken." Well, you have to be very, very careful about the reality that you're boldly speaking into existence, because we make meaning out of our reality, or we construct our reality by the words that we use to describe it. And one of the things that's completely in our control is the choice of the words we use. So if you describe yourself, it's like Henry Ford, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. That's a famous quote. But if you're describing yourself as permanently broken, what are the chances of ever putting the pieces back together? It's a hell of a lot lower than if you tell yourself will heal, or I will continue to heal. Maybe there's no end point. Who knows? One of the examples is for me is, so let's say I was fortunate enough to live to 100. I had Chloe when I was 30. So I would have had, if that was the case, I would have had 70 years on this earth with her. So I could spend my entire life, the entire rest of my life, feeling ripped off because I didn't get, the full 70 years on this earth with Chloe. Or I could choose to be grateful that I had 19 with her because 19 is a hell of a lot better than zero. And so there's a lot of the time that I'm able to do that. When I am in the middle of like a really intense upsurge in grief, and I'm feeling a tremendous amount of pain, no, I'm not always able to, in that state, make myself change my perspective. Like maybe I'm feeling like upset, or maybe I am feeling ripped off. Sometimes in that moment, a lot of times when the grief is super intense, I'm not able to be grateful in those moments. I just need to be sad. But I always remember that when the moment passes, when this wave of grief washes over me like they always do, I always know that I will be able to come back to gratitude again. And that makes even the most painful moments a little bit less, a little bit, because again, I know I have capability, like I'll have the capability to make it more positive and productive choice about how I choose to look at it once the wave of sadness passes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so true that you speak worlds out of words. It's so powerful. And I think what you're getting at there is the concept of a victim mindset. And I think people can think that you are disrespecting what they've been through by calling them a victim. But I like to tell people it's actually just changing, to use your words, your perspective on what you've been through and not give it so much power. And that's part of the effects that the trauma has, is that it robs you of the power to believe you can do anything about it. Because when it happens to you, you couldn't do anything about it. You couldn't predict it. You didn't plan it. It smacked you like a Mack truck and you were left helpless. The lie is that you will always be helpless, that the pain and the suffering will always have power over you. And I use this analogy of Peter Pan, that classic kids movie, and how Peter Pan represents the victim, the underdeveloped man who's always being coddled and needing compliments and never going through any pain. And Wendy represents the hyperhero. And oftentimes when you experience trauma, you're one of those. And for me, when I went through my loss of my dad when I was young, I was the victim. I felt robbed of opportunity. And so I caved in. Anytime there was challenge and there was pain, I would run like it was the plague. I would avoid it and I would point fingers. What's this person's fault? It's because of this. And my life wasn't necessarily terrible, but it was aimless and it was unfulfilled because I never took responsibility. And that's the thing we have to realize, is when the trauma happens to you, whether or not you like it, it's yours. It's yours to own because now it's happened to you and you have to choose what you do about it. And what you said about the parents making these absolute statements about who they are, that's giving in to the unredemptive nature of what's happening. It's like, yes, absolutely, for a period of time, and you can shift though. And this whole victim mindset, moving from a victim to a hero, you have this cool analogy about a jaguar in Costa Rica. I'm curious if you'd be down to share.
Yeah, I'd love to share. And I just wanted to say, as I was listening to you talk there, I think it's so easy to be ensnared in a victim mindset without even realizing it. And it can manifest itself in so many different ways. Like when I think of myself when I was still drinking, I was 100% in a full victim mindset. I mean, without even realizing it. But one of the ways that I think back to that time is the way I described what happened to me, was really always about the tragic aspect of it, the incredibly dark times we went through in the 5 years leading up to her death, the suicide, all of that. Like, and whenever I talked about that experience, that is what I focused on. And of course, that's all true. I mean, it was tragic and it was incredibly difficult. But as I stopped drinking and I started to grow and heal, the narrative around it changed. So it became less about the tragedy and more about acknowledging the tragedy, but also, being able to see and embrace the idea that there was also some incredible gifts that came from this tragedy, and that both of those both of these seemingly like yin and yang, these seemingly, concepts that seem so counter to each other, they work in harmony. In any tragedy, there's gifts. And as I started realizing that and started looking for them and started taking those gifts and using them in the service of others, the way I started talking about it changed, and I think that was a really interesting revelation for me. So if you have gone through, a traumatic experience of any kind, and you find that when you talk about it, notice what you focus on, because there's clues there to, what state of mind you're in. And if you find yourself like really talking about only the negative aspects of it and all the horrible things that happened to you, and they might have been horrible, but if that's all you're talking about, I think that's a sign, right? That there's probably an opportunity for some growth there.
Mm.
So, yeah.
That's so wise, man. Thank you. It's like you're given a script and you read it and it's like you're saying, you're just reading line by line, this is so terrible, I'll never get over it. And it's a belief to change the script and change what you're reading. That is such a good tool. Pay attention to the language you use, the tone you're using out of it. And one of my favorite authors, Richard Rohr, says you can always tell how redeemed someone is by how much redemptive language they use in what they share. So if you are still unreconciled and bitter and resentful, that is going to come out in your belief in the way that you say things. But the way that you're sharing things, I love the word you use, generative. When it feels life giving to share something that was life taking, that's when you know you've done that full circle of healing and reached redemption. Of course, that circle is eternal, it never ends, but you are starting to see things from a different perspective and say, yes, it was as bad and even worse than you could imagine. And here's what I learned. Here's what I'm grateful for. Here's who it's made me to be today. And here's what I can share moving forward, which is so much of your work, man. So, yeah, I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so let me tell you the Jaguar story. So, a couple months after Costa Rica, and that's actually, I think this is a perfect kind of closes the loops and some of the things we were talking about. But so a couple of months, I think it was about 3 months after Chloe passed away. So this would have been May of 2023. I was actually gifted a retreat by somebody I know, incredibly generous, to go down to Costa Rica and participate in this healing retreat. So it was a very holistic kind of approach with like Ayurvedic eating, and there was actually some psychedelic therapy, some ketamine journeys and all that, and it was super insightful. And part of the week was a sweat lodge ceremony. So I mean, for anybody that doesn't know what that is, picture you're in the jungles of Costa Rica. It's basically like a I'm Canadian, so I'm assuming everybody knows what an igloo is, but basically like a wood framed little half dome thing covered in all these heavy blankets, very quite small really. And it was a little pit in the center. And so the idea is, I mean, I go to the sauna every morning, and the sweat lodge makes the sauna somehow seem like a freaking deep freeze, man. Like I don't know how hot it's just outrageously unbelievably hot. So, anyways, the shaman, local indigenous shaman, it's a very beautiful, ritualistic, like sacred type of ceremony. I don't know how he feels taking all these like Western tourists through it, but be that as it may, he was he seemed like he was enjoying it. But as part of the ceremony, the beginning part, he was talking about how, the whole purpose of something like this is to put yourself under some fairly extreme, physical discomfort, duress, because it's in those experiences where healing, it's where the things that maybe you have been avoiding, the ceremony has this way of bringing them to the surface in a way that forces you to confront them. And so he was saying that he goes, this part of the jaguar is the apex predator. And so the idea being that when the jaguar is walking through the jungle and he's confronted with something, uncertain, confusing, threatening even, the jaguar does not turn and run. The jaguar always stands and faces it. And so he goes, for many of you, it'll be incredibly confronting. Things will surface that you've maybe been trying to avoid. And you have a choice. You have a choice because you are absolutely free to get up and leave at any time. And, but my encouragement to you is when the ceremony shows you what you need to be shown, my encouragement to you is to be the jaguar and face it. And I was like, man, that's so powerful, you know? And so we went into the ceremony, and I mean, it was ungodly. Like, it was like Hades, man, like just hot as hell. And I'm in there, and it's pitch black, it's super steamy in there. There's like these red hot rocks, and he's chanting, and you're all crammed in next to each other. You can't see anything, you can't move. And I just remember whispering to myself, be the jaguar, be the jaguar, be the jaguar. And when I left, I just thought that visual was so powerful. And again, remembering that our words create our worlds. I got a jaguar tattooed on my arm because so whenever a wave of grief happens, what I was doing was I was telling myself to allow myself to fully experience it. And it was always trying to remind myself of that. And I'll be honest, that language does not resonate with me. It sounds like really passive. And so after that ceremony, I started telling myself just to be the jaguar and face it. And what's funny is that's the only thing that's changed. I'm not doing anything differently at all, like between experiencing it and facing it. It's just sitting there in the discomfort. It could be crying my head off. It could be whatever, writing. It could just be sitting there, doing some breath practice or whatever to get my way through it. But the sort of the visual or the language around the idea of like stiffening my spine, squaring my shoulders, and facing this thing gives me strength that I find really helpful. So the moral of the story is that, whenever we're presented with something that, again, that seems intolerable, we always have the choice. We have the choice to run, and we have the choice to face it. And, again, finding words to use that really resonate with you personally and that maybe act as a source of strength, I think just a really crucial part of the healing process is how you describe your experience to yourself.
Mm. Yeah, man, that's such a cool story. And the fact that you found your archetype, even as Carl Jung would say, the symbol that transcended time and culture and allowed you to resonate on a deep level with it. And I do think there's this innate, not just desire, but need, both for men and women, of course, to face anything that's in front of you, but especially men in a way that feels honest, but secure. In that experience, you were honest that you didn't want to face it. You were going to have trouble facing it, and that it wasn't going to feel good facing it. But the security said, I'm going to do it anyway. I need to do it anyway. It's going to be best if I do it anyway. And you hung in there and did that. And I think because we've lost an intentional exposure to challenge, that we become unintentionally passive and weak, and we don't face things, not because we actually can't, but because we're not proactively seeking that. It's kind of like how they say in healthcare that if you expose yourself to acute stress intentionally, something like the sauna, cold tub, exercise, prevents long-term chronic stress passively. And I think the same is with challenge, that if we don't have these touch points, and of course, going to Costa Rica and going to sweat lodges, the apex of experiences and being able to have that. But I'm sure now in your day-to-day life, it sounds like you've implemented practices and disciplines and tools to help on a smaller level integrate into your life to be able to continually show up and be the jaguar in your everyday life. And it leads me to my last question here. You talk about this idea of a 20-year head start. You're in your 50s, I'm in my 30s. I think for each of us, respectively, we delayed our healing in our own ways. What would it look like if men received better emotional education earlier on in life? How might our culture change if we taught emotional intelligence the way that we teach other skills like math, science, finance, sports, all that kind of stuff?
Oh man, that's a great question. I wanted to say too, just before I answer that question, is thinking about one of the things as guys that we all wonder, right? Is and we all imagine this, especially when we're younger and we're full of testosterone. We know how many times have we pictured, being outside at a bar and some dude comes up to us and how we're going to kick his ass, but secretly we don't know what we would do in that
Yeah, that's
situation, right?
right.
Like, so you got to whatever. Like, I mean, you got to turn, run. What are you going to do? And so, it's something we always wonder. And the thing is, for most of us, especially as you get older, those situations are not going to happen, but what will happen is you will lose someone you care about. That is a universal part of the human experience. And so, sometimes I think we obsess too much about how we would deal with a situation that probably a very difficult, emotionally challenging, maybe physically challenging, but emotionally challenging situation that we probably aren't ever going to face, especially as we get older, versus directing more of our attention to realizing that a lot of those same ideas are, applied to facing what needs the emotionally difficult situation of losing someone or someone you care about deeply. So I was thinking about that
Yeah.
as you were talking. I
Thank you.
never really thought about that before until I was listening to you. So, but yeah, back to your question. I mean, so I think what people don't realize, and I wish someone had told me this when I was younger, but everything you do in your entire life is done in relationship with somebody else. So, that might be your relationship with yourself, but usually it's your relationship with somebody else. So the more effective we are at building mutually beneficial relationships with other people, the more meaningful and fulfilling a life we're going to have, and the more opportunities we're going to create for ourselves. So when you think about the idea of emotional intelligence, I mean, what does that mean? So people hear this term, right? Well, what does it mean? Well, it's basically four different things. It's self-awareness, right? So understanding what is happening to you, like understanding and being able to articulate your internal condition, your experience. And so how I usually describe that is if you understand what you're observing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and what you want for yourself and others in any moment, like in any given moment, that's self-awareness. Most people can't do that. So what guys will do, for example, is they'll be like, let's say they are trying to put something together and they can't put it together and they get all pissed off about it. Most guys don't have the emotional intelligence to realize that anger is actually a secondary emotion. And they might say, somebody with emotional intelligence can say, I feel really frustrated and upset right now because I feel dumb because this is the third time I've tried to put this together and I can't get it to work. And I don't know what the problem is. That's what an emotionally intelligent person will say. And the better able you are to understand that, the more likely you are to take actions, like more appropriate actions, but the more likely you'll be able to describe it to somebody else. That's self-awareness. The other one is self-regulation, right? So creating space between stimulus and response. So how effectively are you able to hear what someone has to say, maybe that you don't like, or experience a situation you don't like, and pause, even if it's just for a second, and choose a response rather than just being triggered and having this base response. Because when you have those responses, like, somebody says something and I fly off the handle, when that happens, it's never the most effective response. Right. So, I always think about it in terms of self-regulation is really about being able to be effective in emotionally challenging situations. And one of the questions you can ask yourself, one of the mantras I always remind myself is, being effective is better than being right. So if you have an argument with someone and you destroy the relationship in the way that you prove yourself right, how effective have you actually been? Not very. And that's so many people, especially guys, get locked into this like zero sum game way of thinking. Like, if there's a disagreement with someone, I got to win, they got to lose. Right. And I mean, it's pathetic. And I'm saying that as someone who looked at it this way for a long time. So that's the first two pillars: self-regulation, self-awareness. The other one is relationship management, right? Which is how good am I at building mutually beneficial relationships with the people around me? And again, it's whether it's at work or whether it's at home, all the same skills apply. That's the best part. So if you learn skills of how to validate people's emotions, for example, that's a big one. There's such high leverage things to learn because they make you more effective at work and they make you more effective at home. And then the last one is social awareness. Social awareness is just understanding how your words and actions impact the people who are on the receiving end of them. So think about the person who invades your personal space when they're talking to you and are oblivious to it, or like who are talking on forever and they can't realize that everybody's rolling their eyes and checking their watch and inching towards a door trying to run away screaming. Like, that's social awareness. So the point is that those four pillars, if you learn those when you're younger, they are way more predictive of career success. EQ is way more predictive of career success than IQ. right? And so if we learn, to me, there is no higher returning investment of time and energy than learning the skills of emotional intelligence, because they literally are applicable in every interaction you will ever have with another human being.
Yeah, that's so helpful. It reminds me, I'm not sure if you're aware of DBT, dialectical
Yep.
behavioral therapy. Those are all concepts in there. They're all so simple, so straightforward, so practical. And what you said about the effectiveness, I mean, I think in a lot of my couples work, I could just say that and leave the room and let them
Yeah.
sit with
Right.
that one. But I agree. And the other thing is that if you learn it when you're younger, in my experience, the stakes are lower for taking the risk of trying it out. I mean, when you have years of conditioning not doing it, the other thing is now you have all this baggage to address before you can even start practicing and get back to baseline. And I find a lot of my reconciliation with myself and with others was having to undo all the shit that I created from the storms of my chaos of not regulating and being aware and checking my social and relationships. And if you do it when you're younger, it's less risky. You have less baggage to deal with. And if you get good at it young, breeds returns until you die. So that return on investment is like the compound interest, it just continues to build and you only get better and it only sets you up for more success. And yeah, I think that's so true. I appreciate you sharing those pillars. And it's something that, any guy that's going to ask me for guidance, which a lot of young men are looking, where do I start? This is such a simple foundational way. So thank you for that, man. Thank you for all your wisdom and sharing your story. I'm curious, where can people find you and the work that you're up to?
Yeah, I mean, I do most of the writing I do at improvingman.substack.com. Lots of stuff there about grief for men, but also some of the tools we were talking about today. My business is at the Ames Institute, so we're a management consulting and leadership development company. So that's ames-institute.com. And I also have a TikTok where I talk about grief, and that's at jason.s.mackenzie, Mackenzie.
Sweet, man. Well, we will put all that in the show notes. And yeah, just appreciate your writing. I mean, that's how I found you to begin with. Your honest sharing on Substack. And as a man, being a grief advocate, teaching us the stereotypical ways of doing it in a wrong way. And what will hopefully be soon the new stereotypical way of processing grief and pain and loss as a man and moving forward more effectively. So thank you again for sharing.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, man.
All right, guys, until next time.